Welcome everybody to Upwards, the latest episode of our live stream series to do with tech, security, and startup scene here in Auckland, New Zealand. This gets syndicated out to the world in different places. So you'll see us on the podcast, you'll see us on YouTube, and you may even be watching us on LinkedIn as we speak right here, right now. So welcome again. It's good to have you here today. I'm joined by Walter Rumsby. Welcome, Walter.
Hi.
Walter is a long-time friend of mine and a member of the tech community here in NZ. He's also the head of product engineering at CONQA currently, and has had a few different roles throughout the local scene here, which we'll talk about in a little while. I've known Walter for probably at least 10 years, and he's also a customer of ours at Onwardly, which we're really grateful for, and all-round very interesting and experienced guy when it comes to software engineering and the like. So welcome Walter. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. It's good to be here.
Very cool to have you here. So we'll be talking a little bit about sort of leadership today, startups and security, a little bit of mixture of everything. We're going to dive into Walter's story, his background, in the engineering field. He's been around for a little while, just like a few of us have, and we'll be talking about his journey in his latest into security and his latest gig at CONQA as well. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Phil. I'm founder of Onwardly. We're a local startup here as well, helping other companies, especially startups, build, manage, and scale their own security and privacy programs. So we're all about helping make these things super accessible, helping make leaders successful in their roles at security, and really helping customers protect themselves first and foremost. So that's what we're all about, and we're hoping to add some value to the conversation by having these weekly chats on our podcast called Upwards. So if you haven't heard of us, never seen us before, then you can subscribe on wherever you get your podcasts to Upwards, produced by Onwardly. And you can also find us, as we mentioned, on LinkedIn and on YouTube, and probably a few other places as well. You'll see us there. So let's get into it. Welcome again, Walter. Great to see you again.
Nice to be here. Nice to be here on such a nice day as well.
Indeed, it's finally starting to turn sunny in Auckland after what feels like an eternity of winter. So that's why we're slightly more happier than normal, and hope is at hand, as we say. It's our turn to have summer. The northern hemisphere can go the other way for a change. So I'm looking forward to the summer. Walter, you've been around a little while, and I'm very keen to kind of hear a little bit more about your story. Perhaps you can share with us, how did you get started? How did you end up where you are today? And what does that journey look like for you?
Yeah, I kind of think, from a career point of view, it almost seemed like computers were always going to be what I did. I'm sort of that generation who had those sort of VIC-20, Commodore 64, maybe Amiga, Amstrad type computers, and had those Osborne programming books. And, so I was writing computer programs from the age of 8. I even wrote programs for my mother to help her at work when I was like 12 or 13. And it was kind of like a second language for me. So, I guess sort of coming into my career around the age of the web, and the web took off. That was also really exciting. Worked a little bit in New Zealand, worked in Australia, came back to New Zealand, and then I guess over the last almost 20 years, kind of worked around health, Xero, my food bag, and now at CONQA. So it's been interesting seeing growth in all of those organizations. Like when I started at Xero, there was maybe 3 or 4 engineers in the Auckland office, and that office now, as I understand it, is huge. There's hundreds of engineers there. Yeah, and so that was very interesting, sort of just from a culture point of view. And I remember really distinctly actually having been at Orion for like 8, maybe almost 9 years. The first 6 months I was at Xero, I was like, I'm actually mainly going to keep quiet and just observe what's different here. And it was funny because I felt that there were a lot of differences, and then maybe after 6 or 9 months, we did one of these best places to work surveys, which Orion had done several of, and I was sort of surprised that the results were the same. Um, in the sense of the things that people rated highly were the same, and the things that people rated poorly the same. So maybe not the exact same scores, but I guess where people felt positive and where maybe people felt a connection was common, and where people were sort of frustrated with things that they struggled with was also common, even though my personal experience of the organizations was quite different. Um,
Mm.
and I think that probably, I mean, shaped a lot of my thinking about where I am today or what I do today. Um, and I guess also in a similar way, like when I went to my food bag, previously they had their development being done externally, and so I came in and helped form a team. So again, seeing that, um, it's almost, maybe it's not necessarily the beginning, but seeing a beginning and going through a journey. It's interesting. There's always challenges. There's always problems that sort of seem insurmountable, and then you sort of get over them. And I think perhaps the risk of somebody with my experiences now is sometimes maybe everybody else in the room is like, oh my God, this is terrible. And I might be there going, oh, this is fine. We've been here before. This is okay. So, maybe over time you kind of lose a little bit, maybe not of empathy, but of being attuned to everybody in the room. That might be a thing. Maybe that's, I don't know. But that's not, I mean, I've certainly had that where I felt like people are going, the sky's falling. And it's like, no, it's just a bit of the ceiling. It's okay. we can deal with that one.
Yeah, I do think that comes with experience, really, and I've seen that a few times as well. It's not that you lack empathy necessarily, but that you realize there's a bigger, you realize maybe a slightly further view in the distance of what's likely to happen, and it doesn't go out as much,
Yeah, my general theory is always basically, if this is your sort of the solar system or the outer ring of your sort of capabilities, you're always sort of operating close to that. And then over time, ideally that's expanding. So ideally, like, anyone and kind of, I'd say in any tech organization, any tech role should be, the things that are easy for us today, or the things that we don't really think about or worry about, were things that a year ago we were anxious about and we weren't sure we could do. And the things we struggled with a year ago are things that are easy. I mean, ideally, right? That's kind of that. Are we growing in terms of capability is probably the way of thinking about that.
And yeah, exactly. And it probably always feels hard at the time, but it's just you're tackling harder and harder problems as you go. It's like whereas you're exercising, you're getting more fit, but it always feels hard because you're always at the edge of what you can handle and grow. That's good, actually a really good segue sort of into your leadership journey, because I imagine you started out, you're a long time developer. That's a lot of developers, engineers I've met, literally was the same, started coding when they're 8 years old or 10 years old, first system. Eventually, it seems inevitable you end up in some sort of leadership position. I think part due to your experience, your maturity, the need to mentor younger engineers and things like that. Tell us a little bit about that for you, and perhaps where you are now and how that journey went for you in terms of leadership.
Kind of funnily, in a way, I think I've always had interest in sort of what I kind of felt like were related concepts, like user experience and maybe product management, or what the business was doing. So I never really, viewed myself as just a technologist, or I guess maybe always believed that I could be better at my job if I kind of understood a broader version of that. So in a way, in kind of every role I've been in a way, I'd sort of pipe up, and then they're like, oh, well, why don't you go and talk to the customer, or why don't you go and do this? So, certainly, I haven't been at the sort of role that I have now, you know, for my entire career, but sort of by always sort of showing that kind of interest and that curiosity and wanting to know more, it's sort of, I think, helped me, you know, it's sort of mutual, like by showing an interest, you sort of, that interest gets fed generally, you know. I think, you know, there are certain situations or experiences where, you know, I think certain managers have said, why are you developers talking to each other? You know, and that sort of classical way of like you need to be typing, and, you know, the engineers are sort of saying, well, how could we model this? What would this about? What would help us here? Like how far forward do we need to go? But those conversations are really vital. And yeah, and you know, there's I think very much in the New Zealand technology scene, it's pretty hard to think of pure consumer technology businesses. I mean, maybe you could say working for, say, a telco, and you're working on the sort of storefront or some sort of, you know, public-facing sort of part of their offering. But that's not quite an Uber or a Spotify type thing. So New Zealand tech businesses tend to be, you know, you've got, what is it? You know, we do quality assurance for trade contractors in the construction industry, and, you know, we tend to favour people who've got a high compliance need or willingness to do compliance. You know, you have the sort of agri-tech businesses. You know, even Xero is like you know, focused on a vertical, which means that, you know, often I think for developers in those contexts, it's like it's the concepts and what they're working on isn't necessarily clear to them. They don't quite understand. You know, if somebody says, oh, well, here we go, this is the balance sheet screen, it sort of becomes like this sort of, you know, what is a balance sheet? Why is this important? What does this matter? What are people trying to achieve? And I think perhaps maybe certainly in a B2B context, you probably need to be asking those questions or searching for those answers more, because if you're working on a ride hailing thing, you're like, oh, okay, well, so I push a button on my phone and a car comes, great. You know, what if I'm in a different city, right? Is, you know, there's all these sort of obvious questions that arise from that just because it's something that you're going to dog food. And so, I mean, there's also that, you know, can you successfully dog food a B2B thing if it's different? I mean, that's sort of interesting thing. So I guess, in a way, I sort of, I mean, maybe that sounds a bit silly. So not so much I always sort of rose to the top, but I was always sort of given responsibility, right? Like I sort of was perceived and was selected as somebody who could be responsible. And I think that was around, you know, engaging across the business and showing an interest in sort of answering those questions or reaching an understanding of what was going on there. You know, I think kind of, I guess, going back to, you know, my time at Xero, at that, you know, I was sort of like a practice lead in the front end space. There was an interesting, I don't know, I'm not sure, you know, potentially a perception that front end engineering was different enough from back end engineering. And I don't know, I'm not sure if that created a glass ceiling or something else for moving up in that sort of role. So I sort of, you know, when I went to my food bag, it was, you know, more just a general technology leader. And I think one of the things kind of in the front end space, I've always sort of pushed the idea of like, these are just standard software engineering ideas, you know, saying, let's read Martin Fowler. I remember seeing Sam Newman, he did a talk with Laura Bell maybe a year ago, and he was saying something similar, in that he's like, I don't really know a lot about front-end engineering, but I think there are similar concerns. It's all just good software engineering in the end. And so that's probably part of it too. It's probably part of it as well.
Ironically, that's even got more. It's got probably a lot more complicated even since you were in that situation. I remember 20 years ago people talking about how HTML was going to be done just all done out of a job. There'd never be any need ever for a front end developer. It would all be point and click, and it felt like it was going that way at the time. And then of course the technology's got way more complicated. It ended up being a full blown discipline in and of itself. Whereas a lot of designers used to code the HTML back in agency land, and that's very much changed. I wonder if we kind of just on that point start to segue just into kind of the security side, because I know you've been part of some companies which have had to take security quite seriously. Obviously Orion with medical data, Xero with financial data. So you're no stranger to this environment. Can you tell us a little bit about being an engineering and security leader combined? Because what we find is that many folks that we talk to are wearing the CTO hat or wearing the equivalent, head of engineering or that kind of senior practitioner engineering person. They're also kind of lumped with security. It comes kind of part of the role, part of the package. So they find themselves a security leader in their company as well. But as we know, security is more than just an engineering concern. I think that's a really important message for a lot of folks. Is it's not just security, it's not just engineering, it's not just AWS or Azure. It's for the whole company. Can you tell us a bit about your experience with that? Because I know that you've been on a particular journey around bringing the rest of the company along when it comes to security and helping convince them it's not just an engineering problem. You talk to us a bit.
Yeah, and I guess you and I have probably talked about this a little bit in the past, and then kind of echoing, what you said about how sort of, people in CTO or whatever role can, those responsibilities can fall to them, it's almost similar, even sort of like general IT, right? Depending on the sort of tech savviness of the rest of the organization or the needs of the rest of the organization. I was speaking to a friend of mine who, was working in a similar role in Australia, and he was like, because we were talking about that point, and he was saying, yeah, that's sort of something that I tried to push back on or try to sort of create this sort of sense of, it is a shared responsibility. And maybe it's kind of funny, I guess, if you mention other organizations and say you think about Xero, right? Maybe you use Xero as a payroll, Xero's payroll offering, right? It's not the CTO who's logging into the payroll offering to, well, it's probably not, to pay people's wages, right? But there needs to be, or the company bank account or whatever it might be. Like there needs to be a high degree of, appropriate security, for the risk there, and kind of, I guess, I think it's sort of I guess I'd sort of say, like, hey, it's not, like it shouldn't be viewed as the responsibility of the computer team, or whatever it is, the technology team to do all of these things, right? Certainly they could say, here's what we recommend, or here's how we're in the context of AWS, here's how we control access to our environments, here's the IAM permissions we give, things like that. But there are certain things, again, going back to, unless partly if the CTO doesn't have access to or even knowledge of all the systems that are at play in an organization, then it's kind of quite difficult for them to say, can you please lock down system X that I don't know about? And so there's interesting, there's things like onboarding and offboarding. Obviously, there's things like tools and training that happen. In our case, we've just recently kind of hit the size where we've gone out to an external IT provider, right? IT management provider. And it is for things around making sure when somebody leaves, like lot of software is licensed per seat, and then if you find somebody who left 6 months ago,
Mm.
and you're like, oh, we've been paying whatever $80 a month for John's seat, and John left 6 months ago, it's sort of, I mean, and especially in today's climate, like
Times
that
that,
money's
times that by 10 or 20, and that adds up pretty quick. Yeah.
yeah. So I mean,
Mm.
there's kind of day-to-day cost reasons, but there's also, I think there's also an interesting thing. It's sort of funny, like there's this concept of, I don't know, like people under a certain age are supposed to be digital natives, right? There's a saying, right? So I think normally you could say everyone under 30 is a digital native because the internet's been around ever since they were 5 or whatever it is. Like the consumer internet's existed, that sort of late 90s period where computers came into the homes, and then, in their late teens or in their 20s, like the iPhone came about, Web 2.0. So there's a lot of familiarity with doing stuff online, and there's some sort of really interesting stuff. I don't really quite know what she's up to today, but people like Dana Boyd was doing a lot of research about 12, 14 years ago about sort of online behavior of teenagers, right? And so there's probably people have almost like in the sort of social media space, they've sort of evolved this way of being safe, and there's sort of this awareness of scams. But there's still, I think there is still that doesn't quite mean that a digital native, I guess, has the same level of knowledge and perhaps learnt paranoia as an implementer. And this sort of maybe,
Still need to be trained.
And like in New Zealand, we just had local body elections, and turnout in local body elections is quite low, and so this has led to another round of people saying we should do online voting, and then anyone who develops online systems is like, please don't do online voting, right? So I think there's an interesting thing there, just of understanding what the potential risks are. It's kind of funny that Matt, is it Honan or Matt Hohan, the kind of famous Wired article from like 2010 or 2012 or something, where he got hacked because his Twitter name was MAT, and basically like they got into a whole bunch of his accounts, mainly through social engineering, and they deleted like his photo library with pictures of his daughter and stuff. And that for me was actually like I read that, and it was funny. That was a real wake up call for me. And I know somebody that I worked with at Orion, like previously, I'd sort of pointed him at a page of sort of potential exploits, web exploits, and I'd sort of only scrolled about 3 screens and gone like, here, there's a lot of information here. And he sort of went through the whole thing and sort of came away terrified. And but I guess, arguably, like informed and sort of understanding of what the risks were. So I think there's how do you responsibly convey the risks? And so, even in that offboarding situation, we had somebody leave recently, and, I was like, I can still see that they have access to some of the systems that they could contact customers through. And, so I sort of mentioned this, and it's like, okay, the offboarding is being handled by these people. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. Just consider this situation. There's somebody who's left the company who still has a means to talk to customers. And it was like, oh, okay.
A big thing we drill home, to all of our customers, indeed, just anyone listening, really, is to have really good offboarding, onboarding and offboarding, like a runbook, like a script, things that you can follow reliably every single time. You can do this, you can do this on paper if you need to, but the important thing is that you take people out of the systems that they don't need to be in any longer, and even review on a regular basis, review people who have changed roles within the company, for example. You don't need to be part of those systems, because over time you can kind of get that role creep in terms of, I'm administrator of this, and I can see all of this and all that sort of stuff. So that's just really, really foundational stuff, and using, and that just, I think to your point is it's not just digital native people that it's anyone, whether they're a really, really smart, switched on person who is well clued up with security, or whether someone who hasn't been exposed to this before. Everyone needs to be kind of come under the same structure so that you can be consistent across the organization. Sometimes as engineering leaders, like you've got kind of salespeople, and you've got marketing people, and you've got engineers, and you've got sort of all different sort of people going on. That some of those people might be kind of in your domain, some of those people may not be. But it sort of falls on that leader to ensure that there's some consistency across the organization.
Yeah, and I guess, I think maybe that's the other thing that I think about is in terms of communicating that, like, I'd sort of say, like, I would almost say that visible responsibility for that probably needs to be, like, perhaps you've got a CTO founded company, right? And the CTO is the CEO or whatever. So that's one thing. But I think where you do have sort of distinct functions, and it's even where you sort of have a somebody in a head of security role, or similar role, their voice saying you should be more, treat your cybersecurity with seriousness might actually not be heard as much as sort of, a more general leader, or maybe even a departmental leader, like perhaps these, depending on the size of the organization. Like I sort of remembered, at an event at Xero, and, our security person sort of came up and said, he's just going to say something. And he said, it's public Wi-Fi, so be careful. And it's sort of interesting, right? Because there was a little bit of lol, he's always saying that, right? He's always worried about security, and potentially that message coming from somebody else might have had more weight to it. So I think that's also part of it, like, because
definitely,
if you compartmentalize it to, I think there's that sort of, if you compartmentalize it to the kind of software delivery team, you're also sort of expanding their remit in an implicit way. So make that explicit, but potentially they don't even have the visibility or the kind of cross-company sway to land that message with conviction.
Yeah, having that sort of executive sponsorship is super powerful when you've got members of that leadership team that people do listen to, that aren't the people just trying to say no, or whatever you want to call them. Having them repeat those messaging points and repeat them really publicly in your stand-ups, on your Slacks or your messaging channels, and then lead by example is one way you can be, get the message out there kind of loud and clear. This is not just, something to slow the company down, but it's an important part of the way that we operate. And that gets harder to do as you get bigger, but it's really, really important.
It is interesting. Last year seemed to have a lot of those high-profile supply chain attacks, and I guess there's been the Optus thing recently, but it hasn't quite had the same kind of, ironically, there was a bit of weight to, because some of those breaches sort of seemed to get known about quite publicly at a general sort of public level. And it sort of sounds a little bit like, there was the that sounds a bit crazy, but the benefit to that was, understanding, hey, even quite capable organizations that try to do the right thing, they can make mistakes. And certainly I know organizations you've been a part of do try to run like a blameless kind of post-mortem process, because it's that acknowledgement of, it's sort of like, we're trying to put as many locks on the door as possible, or as many safety measures as there are, but even then, something might happen. And so, just are you trying to the appropriate degree? Do you have ways of observing, whether or not, or understanding whether or not a problem has happened? Do you have a response plan? And sort of, I think, certainly, I guess if you get to maybe like an Optus style sort of situation, like it probably ends up having to be the CEO or, even the publicity department perhaps having to front foot on that. Like,
on the board potentially as well.
Yeah,
it's everyone involved at that point, 100%.
So it's probably useful for those roles to have an awareness that this could happen and what might happen and what they might have to do, and then that starts to sound a bit unpleasant. So they're like, well, what's happening? What's happening to stop us having to do this?
Those are healthy conversations to have. Like, and I was just talking to Kendra Ross a few weeks back about this, about board level, and it's about identifying what are we protecting. Ultimately, how are we going to protect that? And let's walk through the scenarios that could unfold. And a healthy conversation to have, even though it's a little bit uncomfortable, is like what are the most likely scenarios to happen for us to experience a breach, and how do we respond to that? And by thinking about that and even rehearsing that response, you're in a better position, because we can't necessarily prevent everything, but we can certainly change how we respond to it, and that often makes a huge impact as well. And so having a plan for that and what that looks like is something you can do with, and I think necessarily is done with the leadership team. It's done with your colleagues. It's done with the whole company, and not just the engineering team.
Yeah, and I think, it's kind of funny because I think I've been like, we recently had a leadership offsite, for the senior leadership of the company, and the facilitator there kind of asked us quite an interesting question, and it was basically, he said to everybody there, okay, what's your primary team here at this organization? Who's the primary team that you work with? And I don't remember exactly the answers, but for the most part, people sort of identified with their functional team. Like, if I'm the head of X, then my primary team is X. And the kind of facilitator sort of said to us, like, well, I'd challenge that and say your primary team is actually this team. And at that level, you're responsible for the running of the company across the functions, and then your secondary team are those functional teams, and you're kind of enabling people in those teams to do their work, like, but with the context and sort of coming to agreement, I guess, across the organization, saying, well, actually, we do have to sort of shift priorities, or we do have to focus on this sort of thing. And that was I think that was a really good message. I think, for some people it was a bit of a, oh, okay. And, certainly, one of the kind of takeaways for me from that was sort of almost like trying to make sure and look out for, are we tending into functions, or are we collaborating, and how do we collaborate, and how do we bring voices across the needs of our company? Because everybody is operating, focusing on their priority, and their I guess their focus sort of shifts, and so there needs to be a way of sort of, I guess, talking through that and coming to okay, because you're trying to do X, I understand you're trying to do X. That's difficult for us, or that's at odds with what we're doing here, or we didn't know that. It's easy for us to do something about that, but that doesn't really happen unless there is that sort of collaboration.
100%. I think that's certainly was a learning for me in a previous role, and I think I've sort of seen this message repeated if you're a CTO or a part of the executive team, your first team is no longer your functional team; it's the exec team, and you make decisions and you collaborate and you have a wider view of the whole business. This includes security, and you work with them to deliver what the business needs, because you're now tasked with the success of the business, not just the success of the engineering team, but the whole company. And certainly that's, if you have a voice at that table, which hopefully you do, or someone that does, then that's the place to really raise those kind of concerns and collaborate on security measures for the company, right? Because ultimately, it doesn't matter if it's your team that gets, that causes a breach for someone else. It's still going to affect the company. And so,
the customers don't necessarily go,
customers don't
function X is great. Functions, Y and Z are terrible.
They have one relationship, and that's with the whole company, typically, right? So engineering leaders, very much should be thinking about that. If you're in the size of a company that's kind of, you don't have a dedicated security person, you are often it. Then that's definitely part of your role typically, and you might share it with a few other people, but typically it's on you, and you can play a really important role in that and making sure that the company's safe. Yeah. Well, look, we're at about time here, Walter. This has been super interesting. I think we could talk sort of for about 10 hours here. And maybe we'll do it again at some point. But thank you very much. Thanks for lending us your insights and your time today, and we really appreciate it.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, and enjoy the weather.
Yeah. Likewise, if you're listening to this, hopefully it's sunny where you are. Again, you can find us on Upwards, on wherever you get your podcasts. We're also on LinkedIn and YouTube. Please follow, like, and subscribe. If you'd like to leave us a comment as well, that'd be great. We'll do our best to get back to you and answer those as we see those come through, either for Walter or for myself. Please reach out, and we'd love to keep talking and keep the conversation going. So thank you again.